It's quite interesting.
So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. As I told you, I've called in reinforcements. We have General Capitini, Colonel Stirpe, and Daniele Moro joining us today from Milan. I know you're confused. We are too, because obviously trying to keep up with Trump's statements doesn't make sense. There's no logic. It's total confusion. He himself and we who read him every day, we did in the group. I added some recent things, a list of Trump's statements that I also posted in the chat before the live stream. So if you feel like John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, the famous scene where he's super confused, these are the statements made up to today, and obviously the one we'll open with is the last one. That is, I'm seriously considering withdrawing from NATO. It's true that back in '89, he had already bought a page, I think, in the New York Post where he said this kind of thing. Here, however, you can see for yourselves that the way he describes this war is completely senseless. Between we won, we didn't win, which reminds me of Bassani, we don't need NATO, we need allies, we'll reopen the strait, reopen it yourselves. We give an ultimatum to Iran, which is dead. We give them more time. The war is about to end. We're still negotiating. Meanwhile, Iran says, we're not negotiating with anyone at all. The talks are going well. The war will end soon. And now we will reduce Iran to the Stone Age. You can understand that considering him a rational actor becomes difficult as well. Let's start with you, Daniele, since you have fresh news about his latest statement regarding whether he is considering withdrawing from NATO. Go ahead, Daniele.
Good evening. Thanks for inviting me. Let's get to the point. A few minutes ago, just before we connected on a very important podcast, I'll share the link for Parabellum later for anyone who wants to listen. In full, the former American ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, was interviewed. He was also my director, by the way, from the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, who clarified a point that, in my opinion, we need to reflect on. It's true that when Trump threatens to leave NATO, it has been noted that international treaties, and it's the American Congress with a 2/3 majority that decides to join. But Kurt Volker says, hold on, the American Constitution once again is not clear about the procedure for leaving NATO. And since he, as I'm sure many remember, was part of a trio in American foreign policy during the first Trump administration that played a very interesting role. All three of them argued with Trump. One is former Ambassador John Bolton, two is Kurt Volker, three is Fiona Hill. All three, by the way, two Republicans and one Democrat. All three argued with him. Kurt Volker made one thing clear. Now, knowing Trump, what could he do? He might say, I'm leaving anyway. At that point, Parliament doesn't approve the decision, and he asks the Supreme Court for a ruling. So he sends an informal, non-legal political message within the Atlantic Alliance. This is, knowing Trump, you started with these claims. As people also say on American podcasts, he speaks 10 times and changes his mind 10 times. Macron told him yesterday, stop for a moment and say what you want. The problem, which in my opinion we can discuss if you want, is this. All of us, in my opinion, all of us, even those who analyze this person professionally, don't accept one basic idea. And that is, this person actually has nothing to say, has no plan, has many interests and a lot of envy. The speech he gave, the famous 19 minutes the other night, was basically analyzed for what he didn't say. Also pay attention to the role of Ukraine in the Gulf, which I'm sure you are able to analyze. There are quite a few issues for Trump that aren't going well, including, mind you, the operation Putin carried out by sending aid to give another month of life. Cuba, meaning he mixed things up again, and then Zelensky in the Gulf, and then let's not forget that in May, It's going to be an insanely hot May. There will be two important dates. First, the governor of the Fed changes, and Trump's intention was to lower the rates. Can you imagine if, with the situation in Hormuz and with US government bonds, he's able to do that? Second, on the 14th and 15th, there's the famous meeting with Xi Jinping, and it will also be interesting to see how he gets there.
If he doesn't postpone it again.
Allora, so no, actually, Giorgio, what do you think about this exit from NATO? Because they've been threatening this for a while and it's still causing instability. Rutte immediately rushed over to talk, probably telling him how great he is, handsome, tall, blonde, and so on.
But I have 2 points to make. First, leaving NATO is a very generic statement, but then when you go deeper into the discussion, you have to see that it can have two different meanings, because it's one thing to leave the alliance as such, which is a very complicated thing to do. It would take years to accomplish. It's another thing to leave the integrated military organization, which is what de Gaulle did in 67, something like that, 66, which simply consists of withdrawing the personnel and the permanently assigned military units, but staying in the North Atlantic Council. So maintaining a political position after having withdrawn the support of conventional military forces, which would probably be much more feasible. And he could play on this in his debate. It's another matter if he wanted to do either of those things from the integrated military organization simply by withdrawing further. The integrated military organization, which means withdrawing personnel and military units. But here it also involves withdrawing equipment that is physically located in facilities outside the United States on the territory of allied countries for a joint activity. It's another matter to leave the integrated military organization, which is what de Gaulle did, withdraw the personnel, the assigned military units. But I doubt that even if he managed to get such a political measure through Congress, Donald Trump would see something like that happen during his lifetime.
Paolo, it's doable. We also see the Americans. Lately, there was talk about Crosetto, but it's another thing to get out of what Crosetto did. On the topic of the BAIA, of the bilateral agreement, it's simply about withdrawing military units permanently, but also in Italy. I'm not saying to bomb since we haven't given permission, but still for all movements. Abbiamo seguito questa guerra dall'inizio, da settimane prima, la fase di preparazione passava. Another thing is leaving the integrated military organization, which is what happened. I know I'm from Livorno, and nearby there's Camp Darby. I've seen a lot of stuff go by of that kind, which simply means withdrawing personnel and military units permanently. But what exactly do you want to achieve politically with this back and forth about NATO? He really has the Atlantic Council.
Another thing is, I was following you when you asked what he wants to achieve, but I'm thrown off because I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know. What do I want to achieve? I have no idea. Integrated military, which is Gaul around the 1950s, and so in 75, 77, 78, generally withdrawing personnel, permanently assigned military, remaining in the North Atlantic Council. Of formalized relationships, another military organization, which is what he did. And there are many, you can even retrace them, because it's enough to look at all the laws, agreements, memorandums assigned. But it remains a culture, a way of seeing things, which has been like this for 70 years. Now someone wakes up in the morning and says, starting tomorrow, we won't speak Italian anymore, but we'll speak Finnish because we've spoken Italian until now. But from tomorrow, we'll start speaking Finnish. It's a different matter to leave the integrated military organization. It's like what happened to your old language, excuse me for the metaphor. It takes decades. Now, eternal alliances haven't existed since the Holy Alliance in general. Withdrawing assigned military forces but remaining in the Council, there are so many alliances that have fallen apart. But because the entire economic and political structure of that period had changed profoundly. Now, I don't think NATO will survive. Another matter is the integrated organization, which is what Gaulle did, but remaining in the Council for any possible transition. There is a world without the United States as the main point of reference, a world with something else. Today we say China and India, but who knows if it will become a world where everyone just minds their own business on their own little island. And we go back to pre-Enlightenment discussions. All that work, we're still right at the very beginning, my friend. NATO is one thing, and its dissolution would be a possible consequence, but that's something that would happen a long, long time from now. Then, leaving the integrated military organization, the integrated military, which is what de Gaulle did by withdrawing personnel, permanently assigned military units while remaining in the Council. Infrastructures that are actually made of bricks, real infrastructures paid for by NATO. That is, paid 60% by the United States and the rest by all the others who are part of it. What do? Sell it off, give me my share, and It's a different matter to leave the integrated organization, which is something no one thinks about, like being in NATO's oil pipelines and such. Simply withdraw the personnel and the military units permanently assigned. What you've already paid, you can't save anymore. So Trump's idea is, I won't spend any more on NATO, and then the North Atlantic Council would come in.
Ma metti che per qualche motivo.
Another integrated military organization of pride, Europe would realize that it is still Europe. In simply personnel and permanently assigned military units, but stay. What is happening behind the curtain in the Russian Federation? What is happening in the Middle East with the Sigonella bases? What is happening in North Africa? We won't give it to you anymore. Find a way to see what happens, because we won't cooperate as much as we were supposed to. Leaving the integrated military organization, as de Gaulle did, only means permanently assigned military units stay. I propose something different.
Sorry, Paolo, it's already happening. Some of the Five Eyes have stopped sharing information or part of the information, so there is already growing mistrust.
Let's say the eyes and ears of the United States that look toward the Far East, toward the Middle East, and deep into the Middle East, toward Africa. In your opinion, when they look toward these areas, where are they sitting? Are they sitting in Europe?
Let me ask you something. He says little support from the Allies. But what obligations would NATO allies have to follow the Americans in a war declared by them? Unilaterally, without any approval, without any consultation, and so on.
Ma faccio un esempio, se domani...
If tomorrow Trump decides to go to war with Cuba, can you imagine that? Luxembourg invading Cuba, Belgium sending a battalion of paratroopers to invade Cuba because of NATO's interests. Saying it out loud sounds terrible. It doesn't make any sense.
E poi
Tra l'altro Cuba è a sud del tropico del Cancro.
It seems to me that somewhere it's written that NATO is a defensive organization, meaning it waits for someone to threaten its way of life or its territory before reacting. It's a reactive organization, not an active one.
But it has a very specific geographical limit.
Here, tell them what it is so at least everyone can be calm.
The Tropic of Cancer, which passes between Florida and Cuba, was deliberately set when there was already a Cuban issue to keep Europeans out of any discussions involving the American backyard.
And there's also another little part regarding the Atlantic and Europe.
So the Middle East is excluded.
A little part of Turkey that could say, well, Turkey could say that in one sense it was born, and in another it was badly born or not born at all.
The entire Kurdish area was specifically excluded.
But the American and NATO bases in Europe, when they use their radars, their detection systems, I call them eyes or ears, the closer you are to the things you want to listen to and see, the better it works. It's obvious when you think about it. Then imagine when you cut off this capability yourself, because instead of being on the border with Poland or in Romania, you have to do the same thing while being in Massachusetts. And you understand that there is.
Piccolo dettaglio che io aggiungerei. If support for Israel is Trump's passion and one of the main priorities of American foreign policy, for the United States, it is strategically impossible to support Israel without European cooperation. Because whatever the Americans want to send to Israel must necessarily pass through European territory. It is impossible for the Americans to support Israel without Europe. The day Trump leaves NATO, the very next day, the Israeli government, whoever is in power in Jerusalem at that moment, will immediately make contact with the European nations to secure their support. Because American support is there anyway.
Access to the Mediterranean, there are several options. The Mediterranean serves as a junction point between the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Atlantic Ocean, which are two oceans of primary interest to the United States, and this connection happens through the Mediterranean. You might say, but I can sail however I want. Yes, but you shouldn't. I mean, there are the bases in Gaeta, there are the ports, the current aircraft carrier Ford, which ended up here with clogged toilets and a few other little problems. It's at a Greek base, it's being kept in a NATO base, at least to repair it and to take it away. I mean, just imagine this whole world where people help each other for very important things and for much less important things, and then at some point, everyone starts looking at each other in a really bad way. And then when you leave me, it's hard to get back together and say it was all just a joke.
In one sentence,
America would lose 50% of its global projection capability.
You might as well shoot yourself, huh?
all right, I'll answer the questions too. Is it harder to fight in caves and mountains or in city tunnels? Well, caves and tunnels are pretty much the same. Go back to the live stream we did with Munaretto, former Italian Special Forces, when we talked about gas and what it means to fight, with the difficulty that tunnels are in the city on flat ground. In the mountains, first, you also have to climb.
But there's the advantage that there's less collateral damage. Yes.
True. That too.
You can always blow up the tunnel, and who cares?
Now we'll also get to all the things that are happening, because obviously there's the F-15 issue and so on. But first, we need to talk about the bigger issues. And since there's this excellent comment from Doc Berry with the US out of NATO, Russia knows it could take advantage of the situation for an intervention in the Baltics in a few years, since Europe would be on its own. We've talked about it, and there are also consequences for the war in Ukraine. If we look at Zelensky, who goes and obviously promotes his drones and his technical staff, and also because this has been talked about in recent days, the Pentagon was considering redirecting military aid intended for Ukraine to the Middle East, because obviously there's a need for anti-aircraft systems and other things. So, in quotes, the Gulf monarchies become competitors from the point of view of need. We're talking about the PUR, that mechanism where NATO and the Europeans put in the money. The Americans basically sell us the weapons. It seems that it was walked back in the last interview I saw, which is also picked up by the Kiwi Independent. It seems that the foreign minister, Henry Sibica, held a conference and said that he spoke with members of the Pentagon and also with Rubio. It seems that for now, this thing is ruled out, or at least postponed. According to the Washington Post, the weapons under consideration include interceptor missiles for air defense ordered through the PUR program, prioritized Ukraine requisite list, which allows other NATO members to fund the procurement of US weapons for Ukraine. For now, it seems that this matter is on hold, but if the war continues, it's not certain that this consideration won't come back into play. So yes, Russia could definitely benefit, not only because of the price of oil if this crisis continues, but also due to a lower availability, even if we provide financial aid to Ukraine. Let's move on to a fundamental issue, which is that of Hegseth, the Secretary of War, who removes the Chief of Staff, Randy George, and 2 other generals connected to him. I don't know if you, Daniele, know anything more about this, but from my perspective, since I'm not involved in political matters, it's that the conduct of this war, let's say it's frowned upon within the armed forces. It's clear that they don't want to move forward because there are no strategic objectives. Trump could get what he wants. That's my fear. We've seen it so many times in history. We've seen it with Zelensky. We've seen it with Putin. We've seen it with Hitler and with many others. When there's a general who tells you, look, this can't be done, instead of listening to the expert, I find a general who tells me it can be done. Historically, when someone is newly appointed, it's difficult to fix these problems left by their predecessor, at least for a while.
Thank you. Absolutely, yes. Let's start from the beginning. Do you remember last year when there was the conference at Quantico with 2,000 American generals called in from all over the world, where this exet, who is mocked on dozens of American podcasts, everyone knows it, even he doesn't deny it, also has issues with alcoholism, very important, who started telling the generals, you're fat, you have long beards, and so on. And they started getting rid of them almost right away. This point is very important. For those who follow American affairs anyway, the American armed forces have historically been a system of social inclusion. If you look at it, one of the areas in which American society historically has allowed minorities, African Americans, Latinos, and so on, to grow and integrate into the American system has been precisely the armed forces. The armed forces, to put it very simply so that everyone can understand, are in some way a reflection of a diverse society with different cultures and traditions. If we think about it, these characteristics directly clash with what you mentioned, Mirko, about the so-called self-proclaimed Secretary of War, who basically wants a country of white Christians, as Trump says, preferably of Swedish or Finnish origin. Colonel Stirpe understands what kind of America they have in mind. He also said, don't send us Africans, for heaven's sake, only whites, and preferably from Northern Europe. Moreover,
without explaining, 40% of the American army is made up of people of Italian origin, Mexican, people of color, and so on. So exactly, these are the lowest classes, exactly.
They fight in the army. Mirko, what you're saying is very important. This very fact helps you understand what we were saying earlier, that despite everything, the United States Armed Forces are a system of inclusion, socialization, and integration. Just think, there are thousands of soldiers wearing the uniform of the United States Army who don't have an American passport. Almost all of them are Latinos who, if they join, put on the uniform and risk their lives, and often they risk it on the front lines. Simply, it's a privileged path to obtain a green card. I mean, you join the American army without even having a green card. The other day, just to give you an example, they announced the Marines swearing-in ceremony. If you check online, I think they're expecting about 6,000 word spread that the famous Secretary of War was even sending the AIS, the notorious hooded guys, to the ceremony. At that point, the relatives of the Latinos said, but I'm not going to my son's ceremony. I'm afraid you'll lock me up. Take me 2,000 kilometers away, put me among the alligators, and that's the end of it. Starting from last year, if you look at the other sensational episode, which was barely mentioned even in the American media, but Washington was shocked by the situation when they started shooting at the boats in the Caribbean. The armed forces of the United States of America at a certain point informed the White House that these were war crimes. War crimes. That is, and it was at that time that they kicked out some generals, this last episode you mentioned, which moreover is linked to the fact that 2 months ago, the chief of staff of the American Armed Forces, when Trump, as you said, I'm going to Iran now, they told him, for heaven's sake, Mr. President, think about it. That is, they told him, be careful. The American Armed Forces had warned him from the very beginning. The American politicians were not listened to. They are in a hellish situation because when General Capitini says Trump says one thing today, tomorrow he says something else. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the American Armed Forces commanders who at that point no longer have the ability to identify a strategy. I mean, what is the path? A month and a half ago, you told the Iranians, stay calm, we're coming. Coming where? The Iranian leadership has disappeared. I killed the second line, as Trump said the other night. Now I'm dealing with the third because these people understand, but these people don't understand anything. I'll add one last detail, Mirko. If it comes out tomorrow, I hope not, that an American pilot has been captured by the
Iranians. Now there's a strong possibility that they're hunting her down, because we'll get to this issue too, but something like this will definitely cause a scandal in America. The reason why the Iranians are taking action right now, so we'll get to this issue as well. There are also questions like, what do we think about the bombing of the Iranian bridge? That's exactly the danger. That is, they go overboard with the destruction of assets. After all, if you don't want to invade, there's no reason to destroy a bridge. Essential to the population, and then they do the same to the Gulf monarchies. If you check out the previous live streams, we showed the dependency rates of countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and so on large plants. Why large plants? From a management and logistics perspective, along with their obsession with building large plants, there's also some megalomania. They've built only a few plants, but they're usually large. These cover between 20% and 30% of the country's needs in terms of desalination, drinking water, and energy. So Iran doesn't have to hit many targets. It just needs to strike 2 or 3 key facilities in these countries. And there's a real humanitarian risk because they don't produce a single carrot in those areas. Everything is imported. So it's also easy for Iran to retaliate against these countries if it were to suffer an attack itself. The bridge, I think it's a matter of symbolism. The Americans destroyed it to show this is the beginning. Are you sure you want us to continue? Then they move on to the energy system. By the way, in the chart I'm showing, you can see that among the soldiers and commissioned officers, the percentage of Asians, Hispanics, and Blacks together makes up more than 50% in most cases. So that's the majority of the American army. So if you alienate this part too, I don't know who you're going to fight with, to be honest. So it's interesting to follow these things too. Let's get to it. I want to ask both Paolo and Giorgio, what do you think about the move to destroy the bridge? And if this is a prelude to what he really wants to do, which is destroy the energy system? And do you have a different opinion from mine about what could happen if they start destroying the Iranian energy system?
Maybe it's because of a constraint, a cultural or professional obligation, but both Giorgio and I ask ourselves the first question, what's the point? For what purpose? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to achieve? So you don't get stuck on, they did this, they did that, they broke this, this, and that, because it depends on what you want to achieve. And you make a list of a series of goals that you consider vital to the path that leads you to your final objective. And here we go back to square one. In the absence of a final objective, it also becomes difficult to identify the path that leads you to the final objective. Because up until now, you can see if we want to generally identify one, it's to strike, to destroy indiscriminately on a large scale, to wear down resistance, which is really the most basic objective you can have. I mean, I destroy your bridge, I take out your dam, I bomb your power plant, I take out your school and the Franciscan nuns' kindergarten. And so you get discouraged, you get a bit down, and you humbly ask for peace, saying enough, enough.
Excuse me, Paolo, if I interrupt you, but could it be that the general was removed because even if he opposed this destruction, it leads absolutely nowhere?
But if you talk like that, even a corporal, not just a general, the corporal would look you in the face and laugh his head off, because that's not how it is. I mean, it's never happened in wars that someone, after being beaten over the head, just said enough. Look, not even the Japanese said enough after the atomic bomb, and they had bombings, they really did. Tokyo was practically razed to the ground with hundreds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths from conventional bombings. Germany, you see the images of Berlin, you see the images of German cities in World War II. No one says enough, enough. You just don't say it. So you have to replace this idea with a goal that is credible, that is believable. And right now, there isn't one. That's why I believe that any sensible general, it's not just the general who decides, any sensible staff when developing a war plan asks you the question, what's the final objective? Where do we want to get to? They say we want to land and occupy Iran. Very well, it will take 25 years and 2 million soldiers. Having said that, you can start to look in detail at how to do it. He says, but I don't have it, so it's not possible, but we do it anyway.
We do a technical job?
In the sense that, and we also do advising work, in the sense that you're told that your wish list with what you have in hand can't be achieved, or it can be achieved at the cost of a certain expense. What you said about hitting infrastructure just for the sake of hitting can seriously encourage the Iranians to do the same. I don't think they'll do it, because simply the infrastructures that will be hit will be those of the United Arab Emirates, of the countries that are there on the Gulf. It's not like you're going to hit the Americans at their core, because their bases there in the surrounding area have already been hit. So if you want to think about a future where you don't make everyone angry, it could be that the Iranians are thinking that. Their enemy is not Qatar, it's not even Bahrain, it's not even Kuwait, it's not them. Their real enemies are Israel and the United States. Now, going and provoking them like they had to do at the beginning, maybe now provoking them too much isn't a good idea. Because, as Giorgio rightly said and reminded us, these people have a range of weapons that the Iranians don't have. They're called money, it's money deposited in American banks, it's billions of dollars. And the only thing that, all things considered, in my opinion, still holds them back from. Can you make a bank transfer to this other bank for me somewhere else? It's that many of these rich, truly wealthy people from the Gulf have their personal assets in the United States. And the risk of making the Americans angry, with the real risk that from one day to the next, they won't give you your money anymore, that's what holds them back. All things considered. So I don't see retaliation against the Gulf countries as a necessary or immediate option. Of course, we could see a massive or an increased or attempted increase in pressure on Israel or on American bases for what little that does. But I don't think it's smart to do the same thing to people who you'll end up having to deal with later, even after the war is over. And in the long run, it could even turn into an advantage. Having a reluctant ally in the American camp rather than an ally who's determined because they have nothing left to lose. So let's see. I believe that the choice to escalate the conflict, to exacerbate the conflict, kicking the can down the road to delay finding a solution is one of the stupidest things you can do. It just means you'll have to work harder to catch up later and accomplishes nothing else. So is this Trump's speech to the nation? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a possible escalation. when he says we have to respect the dead, the fallen, by honoring them with victory. This is the kind of speech that's always made when they're thinking about going even further. No one thinks of honoring the fallen by preventing more deaths, but by causing more to honor the ones you've already lost. It wasn't a good speech. In my opinion, it's a rather dangerous speech, assuming you can even find any rationality in what Donaldo says. Fine.
Well, if possible. This time I'm even more pessimistic than Paolo because professionally I'm a targeteer. And what really makes me pessimistic about the bridge episode is that targeting is a very, very, very sophisticated doctrine, with refined procedures developed over the years, which we absolutely share with the Americans. So when I try to understand American targeting procedures, in this campaign, I think in very detailed terms, because I know their doctrine precisely now, without going into very sophisticated or even classified topics. Let's put it this way. When a targeting campaign is planned, this campaign is not carried out only at the operational level. Once the targeting plan has been drawn up, it is sent up to the political level, because approval is needed. So when CENTCOM completed the targeting plan, it presented the planning to the commander-in-chief not at the level of individual targets, but at the level of categories of targets, who approved it. Now, the trend of American targeting, while in the first 10 or 12 days it was absolutely consistent, which was also what could be expected, because it's a classic. We Westerners demolished the enemy's anti-aircraft capability to try to gain air superiority over the theater, and this was done. Superiority, not supremacy, which is a minimum level, but enough to operate over their territory. Once this was achieved, the targeting we could observe became erratic, or rather, let's clarify, American targeting became erratic. While the Israeli one continued to follow a very precise military logic. The Israelis aim to destroy the launchers of Iranian medium-range missiles, the ones that can reach Israel. It makes sense, both militarily and politically. Israel is carrying out its campaign, the Americans are not. Once they gained air superiority, they started striking. They jumped between different categories of targets without focusing on any of them.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to ask you this, Giorgio. One day we see the small boats. Now there's also the latest news from the last half hour about an A-10 being hit. The next day they hit the factory, supposedly for drones. And the day after that we see F-18S and other things even deep inside. This is the really serious thing.
There isn't any consistency like, okay, we've chosen this category of targets, we hit them until they're down to 25% operational capacity, 10% operational capacity, there isn't any. So since this isn't the way Americans fight, the American doctrine, which is also ours. The nightmare I have is a historical nightmare that takes me back to the movies we've seen about Hitler. He moves the armies incoherently, interfering with the OKW command, saying, "We do as I say."
If to this
we add the dismissal of the generals, I take it as confirmation.
right now, it's a map that shows in purple all the targets, only Israeli ones. The majority, as we can see, are ballistic commissars and Ray, and
all of them
in a certain area.
That makes sense. While what Americans do really gives me a real nightmarish feeling that either Trump himself or Hegseth is there. For him, calling CENTCOM directly and telling them, today hit this and this, that's a nightmare.
In fact, I wanted to ask you, since the statistics on drone usage remain constant, meaning the launches by them, after the initial drop, you can see that it stays more or less constant. The mosaic defense of Iran remains there with systems moving all over the place. They come out, do shoot and scoot. It also makes targeting extremely complicated since they can keep doing it. It made me think of a parallel. Has anyone played Whack-A-Mole? I remember it at Camp Derby, the one where the moles pop out of the hole and you hit them with the hammer. It's more or less like that. You do targeting, and you did it in Libya too. Is it really possible to stop a system like this?
The more the less sophisticated the weapons we're trying to hit are, the more complicated it becomes. We're no longer discussing destruction, but suppression. What you can try to destroy is what Israel is doing, the launchers of the big missiles. But trying to suppress the launch of drones is illusory. What you can try to do is destroy the factories. They produce the drones, but as for those that have already been produced, there's no hope of being able to destroy them in any significant way. Because even the launch systems are so rudimentary, so small, so pinpoint, so scattered across the territory that it's impossible. What can be done is to destroy the production systems of these drones so that at some point they run out. And you have to prepare yourself to endure their attacks. So no, the less sophisticated we get, the more uncertain things become. Even when you conduct an air campaign, the enemy's air defense systems, when we get down to the level of anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft machine guns, the goal is no longer to destroy them, but to suppress them. To try to reduce their capability, but they will never be completely eliminated.
I have a tough question. In the first phase, we saw Iran starting to strike various countries and partly Israel. When they saw that there was a risk that the Gulf countries would take an active role with the Americans, they redirected their attacks toward Israel. There really is a shift in Iran's targeting. Israel is eliminating Iran's ability to strike Israel. It basically takes this card away from Iran, and if Iran wants to respond, it will only be able to respond against the Gulf monarchies.
In fact, the Gulf monarchies will certainly not be grateful to the Israeli-American alliance. In my opinion, in the long term, we are heading toward a repositioning of the Gulf monarchies. They will shift their strategic dependence from an alliance with the United States to one with someone else. And here we have Zelensky, who is desperately trying to do his part. And I hope the various European governments are also trying to do theirs, because obviously we have a strategic interest in bringing them to our side. It's one of the many strange, bizarre things that Trump is doing. There are a lot of people desperately trying to see a rational and strategic motivation in what he's doing. But he, in reality, is basically damaging the United States without any real benefit for his country. Maybe there's an advantage for his own pockets, but insider trading isn't an area I'm knowledgeable about. I'll leave that to others.
Another element to consider is the strategic dimension, the strategic depth of the two contenders. So the Israeli Air Force has to go and look for missile launchers in an immensely large territory. And to do that, it needs support, technical support, and aerial refueling. It needs everything, a pretty heavy combination of things, and it has to do it in a territory that, by comparison, is immense. I think of Iran, thank goodness, where it involves Israel, which is about the size of Basilicata. Something gets through, if you know what I mean. So when we put the time factor back into this equation, I mean, how can you realistically eliminate every missile threat against Israel? In the short term, it's wishful thinking. You have to dedicate an incredible amount of time just to be able to say they won't launch anymore. But in the meantime, even if they manage to launch 2 that get through, they still keep you on hold for a long time. And while you're on hold, your air forces and even the support your American allies have to give you start to falter. It's a statement from the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Armed Forces. And let's not forget that Israel is also fighting a pretty tough ground war at the same time in Lebanon. They are forced to have a physical presence in the Gaza Strip and are also forced to have an aggressive physical presence in the occupied territories of the West Bank. So, in addition to having a hyperactive air force over Iran, there's also an army that's engaged elsewhere, and even there the air force has to provide some support because it can't not provide it. So the discussion that's happening in Tehran and that will also happen in Tel Aviv is how long can this situation go on to turn around? And the fact that the Mosaic defense designed by the Iranians over the years allows, or would allow in their view, not to have a large mass of impact. And to say, shoot as many as you want, but have you seen? The last week, 7,535 of attention, attention, of attention, and of attention, 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 and of attention, and attention, 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 of attention. Go back to that map if you can. That chart is very interesting because it covers the 34 victories declared by Trump and also covers the same victories declared by Israel. We basically leveled everything. You have that chart there with the drone strikes and everything. While you leveled it all, look what happens to you. Look what happens, leveled and leveled. From a certain point on, pretty much the same thing keeps happening every day. It's not much, but it's enough. Thank you.
The marine insurance companies don't care whether it's 35 missiles or 50.
They don't care, and no one has hit a mine yet, just saying. So whether it's 135, 24, and then add some damage caused by Hezbollah in northern Israel. The situation isn't exactly the bed of roses they're making it out to be.
Sorry.
I understand the strategy.
I mean, Iran just needs to launch 50 drones and 20 missiles for months, months, and months to still create a disaster.
But they planned for that. They knew they would be hit by a terrifying aerial attack. They said it's important that a minimum remains, and they've decided what that is. They put that minimum somewhere, and to go find it, as Giorgio said, it takes a lot of time.
An analogy that helps to understand and that I managed to communicate to some journalists was Tyson fighting against his punching bag. Who wins? The bag never goes down. The bag takes a lot of hits, but it doesn't hit back. But it absorbs them without any problems. Sooner or later, Tyson gets tired.
And this system then creates a mountainous system. The drones use a small truck with a ramp. They launch, return, and repeat. If one truck is destroyed, I deploy another, and this cycle continues indefinitely. I believe that the cost of the JDAM bomb that will be used exceeds that of the small truck and the drones, just to give you an idea, not to mention the operational cost of the personnel. There's a question for you, Daniele. If Trump loses the election, aside from the fact that his approval rating is at its lowest point, lower than at any time since Carter, if I remember correctly, pardoned Nixon, so it's a historic low as well. Will the American stance change? Or is it now an open-ended trajectory? It's true that it's a bit of a tricky question, but is there a sense that if he were to leave, things would return to normal? Or is there a risk that some people, like those who don't show themselves, will start claiming purity? Some of the MAGA people saying to Trump, they'll turn it around and say he sold us out, he didn't keep his promises, I'll carry them forward, since on the other side there's a complete vacuum anyway.
Thank you all. Good question. Let's start with a point we made, if I remember correctly, right at Parabellum, the day after Trump's re-election. Trump represents a trajectory, a sense of unease in how the United States has come to view its allies, starting with NATO, but it also applies to Japan, South Korea, and Australia. At least since Obama's presidency, at least 20 years ago, they started saying you're freeloaders, you're taking advantage, and so on. I was telling a story. The then American ambassador to NATO, another one of my university classmates, told me one day 20 years ago, the Germans are slackers. They basically don't have armed forces. We taxpayers have to pay for it. He was representing the Bush Jr. administration. So Trump is simply the result of an America that for 20 years has turned inward, has deindustrialized by choice of American capitalism, not because the Chinese went at night to steal their companies, to take away their jobs. It was the Americans who handed over a good part of the industrial structure to the Chinese, sending the value of American companies up on Wall Street and down. An electorate that has been left without jobs, without social protection, without a future for their children, that after 20 years of back and forth has found a character, a figure who, General Capitini, we've talked about this before as well, actually seems like someone straight out of a talk show, the kind we also have in Italy. These characters who come and tell you, I'll solve the problems, I'll take care of it, the enemy is there. Trump is the result of American society. 1, 2. Midterm elections. Since the first day of Trump's re-election, I've been saying that Trump won't hold the midterm elections. Many of your followers have also politely asked me how he could avoid doing it. Well, there are still 7 months left, and any moment is a good time to come up with a solution. Some say he could provoke a state of war, he could try to prevent it from happening. The vote count in the states where he knows he could lose, and he wouldn't need to block many states. Meanwhile, he blocks the vote count. Keep in mind, he already did this last time when he was defeated by Biden. He tried 6 times back then to prevent the winner from being declared. 6 times, including the assault at the United States Capitol building. I'll add a third thing. When General Capitini and Colonel Stirpe emphasized the seriousness of the removal of this general with whom you started, I say, pay attention to one thing. In the last few days, really in the last 34 days, something sensational has been happening, in my opinion, within the White House power structure. You have to connect the dismissal of this general with that of the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. Last week, the one who went around wearing a cowboy hat in front of the Latinos, the one, you know, whose husband used to dress up and do dances for her. And there's a rumor that Tulsi Gabbard, who is the head of American intelligence, might also be dismissed. What does this mean? What does this mean? Does it mean that the difficulty your guests are describing in Trump's military strategy is becoming a political strategy for Trump within the United States of America? The problem isn't that he's dropping in the polls. Polls mean little because Congress is still largely submissive to the president. Last week, he went to ask whether he should declare war on Iran or not. And they told him, no, Mr. President, let's move forward. It's a nice special operation. I don't know if you remember who talks about special military operations. And he's all happy. He keeps going like this. The problem isn't the polls. The problem is that if he loses even just one of the two houses of Congress in the new Congress, definitely the House. But some people say it depends. The choice changes from hour to hour. The situation, it could even happen in the Senate. What happens? That he puts them on trial, to put it simply, all members of the current government. He puts them all on trial. And this morning on one of these Washington podcasts, they emphasized something, because he took them out these days and didn't just start because he still has a majority in the Senate. He manages to appoint members of the government by vote. But if after the midterms he ends up facing the House for sure, and maybe even the Senate, he has basically stopped being the president of the United States in practice. Pay attention to one last thing. When he, on Thursday, 2 days ago, or yesterday, sorry, went in person for the first time in the history of the United States of America, a president went in person to a meeting of the US Supreme Court. He stayed there for an hour and a half. With a Supreme Court that is known will deliver another blow by the end of June, like the one with the tariffs. And they say they will reject it, 8-1. The attempt to no longer recognize everyone's right to naturalization, something that has existed for 150 years in the United States of America, the naturalization of children born in the United States of America. So with the character that Trump has, he is radicalizing. He's not just going after the military, he's also going after the government. He's even trying to influence the Supreme Court, which he largely appointed himself. And even now he tells them, but how? I appointed you, and you dare to tell me that what I'm doing isn't constitutional. But nothing is constitutional. Excuse me, he tore down a wing. I passed by there last month. I felt like crying in front of the White House. He demolished it without even asking for permission from the fine arts authorities, saying, anyway, you'll see how beautiful it is later. Anyway, who's going to pay for it? The Pentagon suppliers and US government suppliers spontaneously come up with $400 million.
Yes, as if someone, I don't know, Renzi tore it down. No, calm down. It's as if Renzi or whoever was there at the time, or Maloney, decided to tear down part of Montecitorio. Tear it down.
Tear down part of Palazzo Chigi, because then 5 companies that supply the Italian government come in, they pay for it. So there's no need for Congress's permission. The other day, Congress with a Republican majority ruled against him. Careful, these are all weak, fragile signals from a system, starting with the judicial one, where limits are starting to be imposed on him, limits. What were your guests talking about? Limits. This man doesn't think he should have any limits. That's why he got himself into this mess. He did it against the advice of the military. He did it against what the map tells you. Iran didn't give in. And the new scenario, in my opinion, Colonel Stirpe is right. It's the Gulf. The Gulf has to change because the geostrategic situation has changed.
The Gulf?
Also the area of London. But yesterday's meeting in London of the so-called volunteers ultimately still raises a problem. And that is, it's true, if it's about energy, we Europeans are the first to need it. It passes through Hormuz. Whether we like Trump or not, this problem has to be faced by us Europeans, the Chinese, and the Indians.
But look, I'll take this opportunity, because we'll come back to this when we talk about targeting, because intelligence can also be one of the reasons. I think there are many reasons for the removal of the general, but there's also one related to targeting. Recently, TASS and some other newspapers reported that the Iranians have offered to facilitate, let's say, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, basically in a sort of reverse consortium. That is, to offer it to the Europeans, to the Asian states, obviously not to the Americans, and certainly not to the Israelis. Iran itself is ready to reach an agreement with the Europeans, the Asians, and the other Arab countries on the use of the Strait of Hormuz. This is reported by a representative who spoke through some sources, mainly Iranian, through Russian sources. It certainly won't be accepted, but they make it clear, look, the problem isn't with us, we have it with them. And this is one of the things that the Americans have always feared, that is that people would start buying the petrodollar, the myth of the petrodollar. If it shifts to the petro-euro, it's definitely not something they would want to see. I don't know how realistic it is. We would need Faras for something like that, but I think it's more something thrown out there by the Iranians, which isn't picked up by anyone.
Thank you. Well, they had started getting paid by the Chinese in yuan, so they could just as easily get paid by the Europeans in euros.
Going back to targeting, there's a question from Eugenio Manca. Which targets are still left? Exactly with that concept of mosaic defense. Some of them are a bit buried and some are not. Wait, let me show you this, Giorgio. Because what's coming out, according to US intelligence, is that Iran still maintains a significant missile launch capability, sources say. 50% of that origin, maybe some of it is buried, of course, but you just have to dig out the tunnel again, right? In this sense. So what do you think about this, Giorgio?
But the problem is what we were saying before, constantly shifting focus among different target categories, not the Israelis, but the Americans, inevitably every category. Instead of being constantly reduced down to a predetermined value, they need to be eliminated. Down to 50%, down to 25%, down to 10%. You don't do that because by jumping from one category to another, the work is interrupted, and in fact, the reconstruction by the targeted nation begins immediately. So actually, unfortunately, there are still a lot of targets left. The only ones that really made sense were the launchers, and the launchers are still only being hit by Israel. As Paolo was saying, Israel can only strike up to a certain distance. If the Americans don't work together but work separately, they'll never even reach that level. The problem is that they didn't agree on who the enemy was. Excuse me if this sounds trivial, but is the enemy the Iranian regime or the Iranian nation? That's the problem, because there's a big difference when you're targeting. When you go to hit the bridges, you don't harm the regime at all, you harm the nation, you cause damage. Paradoxically, you even harm the very population and opposition you said you were going to help.
Spiega anche la campagna. Giorgio explained the Israeli campaign too, in the sense that it's completely different.
It's a completely different thing. The Israeli one is consistent. You may agree or disagree politically, but from a strictly military point of view, it's reasonable, professional, consistent, and done quite well. By the way, the Israelis are also the ones who carry out target acquisition because they're the ones who have infiltrated all levels of Iranian society with the Mossad. Without the Israelis, the Americans wouldn't know what to hit. They would only use satellites, and with satellites, you can't find the people mentioned here. Israel's goal in hunting these figures isn't really to overthrow the regime because Israel doesn't have the capability to do that. They should have coordinated with the Americans, who should have organized themselves 6 months or a year earlier to send Starlink terminals, to send satellite radios, to send planes, to send a whole range of aid, to help create an alternative leadership, all things the Americans didn't do, so they have no chance of succeeding in changing the regime. What might Israel want to do? Israel, by mainly targeting clerical figures, might aim to try to transform the regime from a theocratic dictatorship to a mafia-style dictatorship. In the sense that if they bring the pastor into power, there's a chance to turn the regime into a clique very similar to the Venezuelan one. That is basically a power clique that aims to enrich itself and with whom it is possible to make deals.
But look, I'm telling you, these days I had the chance to talk to someone very knowledgeable about Iran, and they told me that yes, there's an aspect of theft and, let's say, corruption, but when it comes to drone and missile contracts, there's basically a death penalty for that. Unlike the Russian side, where everyone knows about the thefts, it's not just me saying this, but also the former prosecutor-in-chief, things are different regarding armaments. We did a live show with Marco Bussi 3 years ago, where he said that about 40% of the funds ended up Russian prosecutors. So it's not propaganda or anything like that. As for military contracts, however, in Iran, precisely because they are extremely ideological, there's no stealing there. They steal on everything else.
Of course, but the difference is that while Iran knows it has to expect an attack, which in fact happened, Russia knows very well that no one will attack Russia. So obviously there's this difference. But the Pasdaran create a power structure aimed at personal enrichment, while the clerics do not, or do so less.
I'll just add one thing. In fact, here we're talking about, it seems that a lack of coherent planning is emerging. So among the elements that are considered in planning at the strategic operational level, there's not just the purely military aspect, like comparing forces, how many missiles you have, how many ships you have, which targets have military significance and which do not, but aspects that are considered secondary compared to the primary military aspect are also taken into account. Culture, religion, the internal cohesion of that country. What is their media system? What TV they watch? What radio they listen to? What they read? Who are they? Who are they? Now, if someone had started to look, answering the question of who the Iranians are historically, not just in relation to the Islamic Republic, they would realize that it is a society based on a very simple concept, a concept of right and wrong. They venerate the Prophet Ali, who went to fight a battle, the Battle of Karbala, knowing very well that he would be defeated, that he would be martyred, that he would be destroyed, but simply because this was the right thing to do. So it's a society that is deeply based on the idea of right and wrong, of black and white, of just and unjust. And this even goes back to the Zoroastrian religion, which predates Shiite Islam. It's a world that sees things in black and white and finds it reprehensible if you use the tools and methods of darkness to prevail over darkness itself. Martyrdom is better. Now, when you have people like this trying to change them by forcing them into a culture that isn't theirs, into something very different, to me, it seems rather unrealistic if that's one of the goals you want to pursue with a certain action. This doesn't mean that there aren't criminals, corrupt people, or wretches. There are probably many of them in Iran as well. But every people has a distinctive trait that makes it complex, different from other people's, and recognizable. The Iranians have chosen this, compared to, for example, the Sunnis. This idea of, I'd rather be killed, but if I'm right, I will bear witness. Khamenei's assassination is a strategic mistake because his whole life has been about martyrdom. You gave him the trump card. It's not about capturing him. It's not about making him a prisoner. It's about turning him and his whole family into martyrs.
He had already thought about his departure, and they created a structure. We have this very top-down idea. Actually, they have, as you saw in the chart of the killings, there are sub-columns where some pawns fall and others take their place. And all the different branches of the armed forces also have a certain degree of autonomy. Yes, yes.
Because you had 20 years to choose them, to pick them. And above all, they see that this strategy, although very bloody, is working so far. They also have a radio, they also have knowledge of the rest of the world, and they also see the reaction of the rest of the world to this war. And the strategy that was set for them at the beginning of this war clearly appears to be functional, which is something that Trump can't say. And we don't know if Netanyahu says the same thing, whom we never mention. But he is asking Israel, with its 9.5 million inhabitants and a military base that is not immense, he is asking for pressure. Exceptional, which I don't know how long can be maintained. And he must always keep in mind that his main ally is the American leadership, which, if really pushed to the limit, might even consider easing the support of it. And easing the support means stopping the war for the Israelis, right? I also think so. I'll just say it straight out. I also think that if the idea of giving up comes up, that the Americans would give up their involvement in this war. I think the possibility of an accident, a tragic accident happening to someone who has these kinds of intentions seems quite likely to me. I don't think Israel would just let it happen, accepting the decision just because you're a sovereign country. In this, Israel has clearly shown that it has no limits or hesitation in going beyond its own size to influence bigger things. If you make a comparison, it's like a knight with a horse. The horse is undoubtedly much bigger than the knight. It's stronger, more intelligent, and it would even have its own will. It would want to do things, to graze or gallop. But it's the knight who weighs much less, but who has coercive tools toward the horse, imposing his direction on it. Now I see the horse as the United States, the knight as Israel. The horse has only one chance, which is to throw off the knight, but that's the only one. There aren't any others. It can't convince him. So let's see if it gets to the point where the horse can't bear the weight of the knight anymore and throws him to the ground. Before doing that, I believe the knight is willing to kill the horse.
So before moving on to the next topics, well, because there are the movements of the 82nd, also the type of bombing the Americans are doing, and also the downing of the F-15, in my opinion, are probably connected to these troop movements, which are not rational. I'm saying it, I've also written it, no sane person would land men from the 82nd or Marines to secure the islands, but there's little rationality to be seen here. Before this, I have to thank tonight's sponsor, which is Inconi. And remember, if you want to support what we do on this channel, one way to do it is obviously to click on the link you find in the chat. I imagine that you, like me, get spammed every day with emails or phone calls from services you don't even remember using. Well, you should know that when a service is free and you sign up, the product is you, and that's why you end up in the databases of data brokers who then resell your information. So what does Inconi do? Inconi basically takes your data, your email, your phone number, and it handles dealing with these data brokers to get you removed. And it does all of this automatically. You can also add multiple emails and phone numbers, and it removes you. It takes care of everything. It doesn't resell your data, unlike the others. It costs very little, actually. Very, very little, because if you use my code, you get a 60% discount. You can find the links in the description, in the chat, in the pinned comment, and you also support the channel. Remember, if they can't find you, they can't bother you. So Inconi is the solution to your problems. I personally use it, and I have to say that I've been bothered less and less, almost not at all now. So, gentlemen, the method. Let's get to the topic of these troop movements that are happening. We know that the 82nd has arrived near Diego Garcia, at least a part of it. It's interesting to note, because more information always comes out, that they were supposed to have a party. There was some kind of reunion for the 82nd and it was cancelled. This means that a deployment is taking place. I want to ask, while you and Paolo are talking, what about me? The only strategy I found that could make sense is to land on the island of Karg, because theoretically, if you occupy the oil facilities, the Iranians wouldn't be able to attack the Marines in the oil facilities unless they want to destroy their own system. But is this thing sustainable? I mean, even if you land there and take it for 2 months, in the long run, what effect does something like that have, unless they want to secure a section of the Strait of Hormuz? Someone has theorized about starting to provide weapons and support to a possible resistance in the country. But here, rationality has already gone out the window. Do you see any sense in these troop movements?
No. The problem is also the quality and the number of troops being sent. Because, frankly, I rule out an assault on Karg for a very simple reason. Karg is protected by an elite Pasdaran regiment, which couldn't be neutralized with a preliminary bombing because the preliminary bombing would also destroy the oil terminals, which is the same reasoning you made, of Garden, a place of suppression following the occupation. This means that anyone who assaulted Karg Island would suffer losses greater than what can be tolerated by public opinion. American Republic, and so I would say the risk would be very high, it would be very costly. It wouldn't take place with the USS Tripoli entering through the Strait of Hormuz and going all the way up the Gulf. Obviously not, even though some people have reasoned that way, of course. The operation would take place by transporting assault troops to Kuwait, and with an assault carried out with the Ospreys, with the tiltrotor aircraft flying directly from Kuwait to Karg, which is a very short distance, and from Kuwait, where there are a lot of American bases and even Italian ones.
Basically, no, to gain and get the advantage of not being bombed first, the Iranians would exploit it, so there would be massive infantry losses.
Exactly. So it's absolutely not feasible from a military point of view, and it wouldn't make sense from a strategic point of view either, because you take Karg and what do you get? You prevent the Iranians from exporting, but the export from Karg still happens through the Strait of Hormuz. So for the Americans, if they wanted to prevent the Iranians from exporting, it would be enough to declare a naval blockade and solve the problem. They would even be within international law. Then of course, they would have to argue with India and China, but that's another matter. However, they would achieve their goal that way without suffering losses, so I would completely rule out the whole Karg idea. A first alternative is the small islands in the Strait of Hormuz.
Lesser Tum, Greater Tum, the ones that are also disputed, so it could also be a little gift for
the United Arab Emirates who claim them. It would also make sense because in theory you could install anti-drone systems there that wouldn't solve the problem but would greatly reduce the problem of drone attacks on oil tankers. Then you would have to convince the insurance agencies that the risk is reduced, and it's not certain that you would be able to convince them. But at least it would make some sense, and it would also be militarily sustainable. It wouldn't solve any problems, and it certainly wouldn't force Iran to surrender. You have to see if it's worth the effort. There is a possibility that Trump could use this factor to say, I want, and say, I'm satisfied. But I repeat, in reality, it wouldn't solve anything. Another alternative is to temporarily occupy the nuclear site where it is believed that the radioactive material used for making nuclear warheads is stored. And if this is the objective, however, the numbers don't add up for me given the forces they've assembled.
Yes, special forces see a lot. You should know where it is. That incompetent guy, they split him into 10. Boom.
That's perfect for the Rangers. Much less for the Marines, definitely not for the 82nd. What's left? Establishing a bridgehead on Iranian territory in the hope that a revolution will then break out. Apart from the fact that any form of internal revolution is now out of the question, where would you establish the bridgehead? In Bandar Abbas. Perfect, a city of 100,000 people and you have 10,000 men but still can't control it. You need a lot more than that. We go to Karbar, almost at the border with Pakistan. You occupy it. The Iranians barely even notice. It's absolutely useless, but then you have to hold it. Anyway, however you look at it, it doesn't make sense. In my opinion, the 82nd will simply be redeployed elsewhere. The Gulf, to give the Emirates and the Saudis the feeling that we're protecting them, in the end, that's how it will go, and it can always be used as a tool of diplomatic pressure. Let's always remember that Trump is convinced he's a great negotiator. He's convinced he's the one who makes the deals, and he does it with the mentality of a bankrupt and a real estate developer. So he's convinced that he puts pressure, he threatens you. You come to your senses, so I have some troops there and I threaten to use them. At the end of the day, for me, this is yet another demonstration that since you move the troops before starting the war, not after the war, it's yet another demonstration that when they decided to start this campaign, they had no idea what they really wanted to do. It's something improvised during the campaign by a child who's playing with the biggest toy in the world. The United States of America and their military apparatus in the biggest amusement park in the world, which is the world itself.
I think he will do it. You know why, Giorgio? Because when a child brings a toy, he wants to use it.
And that's what he's doing. I'm even starting to care.
Because you have a goal too. Oh yeah, there too. I've been following the targeting a lot these days because what a coincidence on Kesham Island. They're taking out the infrastructure, all the small boats. I mean, it seems like a preparatory phase. What a coincidence, right? Where you could intervene with ground troops. I'll also point out that they've arrived, they've doubled. We've seen videos of the A-10S providing support, and I don't know how many. I'm telling you this for the sake of reporting because these are things that came up during the live broadcast. 40 minutes ago, it seems that an A-10 was shot down just recently. Look where, allegedly. There's A-10 activity that's wiping out pretty much all the boats, all the operations. It's not known yet, it's not verified, but all the OSINT sources are talking about this downing of an A-10, and there are reports that the number of A-10S brought into the area has doubled, okay? When you bring a lot of warthogs into the area, it's not just to destroy drones, it's too big of an operation for that number. The warthogs they've brought into the area are all deployed and active in the Strait of Hormuz. At least that's what most of the latest reports are saying. I'll add the big one to that, meaning the activity we've seen, like the famous F-15 that was shot down and confirmed by the Pentagon. One of the pilots was recovered. This is certain. It was first confirmed by an Israeli source on Channel 12 and then also confirmed by the Americans. And above all the pieces, the wreckage that could be seen are compatible. The recovery attempts have also been geolocated. Note that they are talking about one of the two pilots who was recovered. Official Israeli sources, one of the American pilots who was shot down, he has been recovered, but nothing is known yet about the other. It seems that in Iran there is a sort of manhunt and a huge amount of activity by A-10S and American helicopters. We also saw the 130 gunship moving. These are the pieces that were found. As you can see, they have been identified. This is the seat. F-15, which has been, as you can see, confirmed to be from an F-15. It's also true that there was news of an F-15 shot down the other day and CENTCOM denied it. But here they confirmed that one of the pilots was recovered. In the videos we've seen, you can also see that they were refueling in flight. I put them all more or less in a kind of playlist that we can also comment on. This kind of activity is obviously a rescue operation, also because the type of helicopters used is, if I remember correctly, a variant of the Black Hawk, specifically the rescue version. I believe they are a certain type of Pave Hawk, which are specifically used for this kind of recovery missions. So it's normal for them to be operating at this level of risk, right? In a very exposed area between the islands. They're trying to secure the perimeter and they're underestimating the response capability. It goes back to the whole discussion about air superiority, air supremacy, and so on, which clearly still isn't there. It can be considered hostile territory because every 2 or 3 days there's news of a plane being hit, damaged, or shot down. What do you think about this? In the meantime, I'll show you some background video of American activity in the area.
Meanwhile, if I may add something, it's worth remembering that we're focusing on the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz leads to the Persian Gulf. There are almost 600 to 700 kilometers of continuous Iranian coastline on the eastern side. Yes, it's true, you can also control the strait, but what if I don't let you navigate inside the Gulf because I can strike you? Starting from one of those 600 kilometers, which you can't control all of, tell me, what value is there in carrying out a ground operation that either secures nothing or only secures a small island in this context? Do you really think that China and Russia are not providing real-time information about what is happening in Tehran? So it's one of the main features of these. Lower that thing for a moment because the sound from the video makes it hard to talk. Or else we'll hear the video. As I was saying, one of the key factors in this kind of operation is surprise. And when you don't have any element of surprise at all, because you're pretty sure that a real-time warning will be given to the Iranian authorities anyway. You've already taken away something pretty important from them. Second, Tehran's goal might not be to hold the island, but to kill 500 people and say, you explain to them that half a battalion of Marines died just to take a rock we don't even want to defend. For example, if you'd asked politely, we would have given it to you. Just to say, deploying a ground force in this general operational and strategic situation is about the most useless thing you could imagine. Because it has no objectives. I mean, you're inside a port. Basically, you're occupying the breakwater of a port. You're on top and you take control of the end of the port's pier, so no one else can get in. Yes, that's true, but I control anyone who moves inside the port. It doesn't really change anything. When you go and tell those famous oil tankers, go ahead and enter because the strait is clear. Yes, but 40, 50, 60 miles from there, who protects me? Just saying, it's not like it's...
I'm just pointing out, Paolo, that all the activity we're noticing now from the A-10S, the shoot-downs, even the F-15S, are all either in the coastal area at Karg Island or in the coastal area.
No, it's not that they can't do it. I'm just saying it doesn't make sense to do it, but it's nonsense. So the
stuff was mostly kept out of sight.
But if you order a military unit to take, I don't know, whatever you want, Santa Claus's house, they'll do it. Then the question you're raising with Santa Claus's house is another matter. I indirectly make you think that, look, the American naval force keeps quite a distance from the Iranian coast because the aircraft carriers travel 400, 500 miles from the Iranian coast. What does this mean? That they don't have all this great confidence to go close to the coast? And if you want to carry out a ground operation, you have to go close to the coast. You absolutely have to go there. So, I repeat, it may be that the goal, in these terms, of any Iranian commander in any part of the front is just to kill a certain number of people, and that's it. Also, because once you've landed on the Soap Mountain somewhere, you stay there, what are you going to do? Because what's the point? You invade Russia with 400 people.
Come on, I hope they don't do something like Gallipoli, because there's a real risk here.
But that one was well planned but poorly executed. I mean, all in all, there was a reason to take Gallipoli. If you read about it, an amphibious operation had never been done before. There were no means, no experience, no reconnaissance, but the idea of closing the Dardanelles made sense. In fact, here it doesn't make any sense at all because you can't close off Iran with 5,000 Marines no matter where you put them.
But that's what Giorgio was saying earlier, right, Paolo? I mean, targeting, we see it because we follow it, right? One day the operations are in the area, or in these 3 days they're in these two areas, and in the previous weeks they were a bit scattered all over the place.
The comparison with Afghanistan. Afghanistan had American forces, operational and combat troops, way more than 5,000 people. To take control of a territory that's not all that different from Iran in terms of orography and so on. You had the security of controlling your bases, and even then, only up to a certain point. As soon as you stepped outside, And there was a much larger number of soldiers than what you can deploy in the center of a territory in a hostile country, which isn't Afghanistan. Here it's the Taliban. These are really ignorant people, just to be clear. This is a little army, and they do have some of it. Quindi, so imagining that the Iranians would just raise their hands when they see them coming, I don't think that's exactly what they're expecting. But they've been spying.
Since you also mentioned the Chinese, etc. Yes, we know there's a ship full of Chinese radars in the area, which is definitely providing them with information. It's harder from this angle. I can even tell you where the American ship is, but technically the Iranians aren't particularly skilled at hitting a moving target. Unless the Chinese want to provide them with the guidance system themselves, then that would be direct involvement. Today, I saw a lot of memes, but also some covers from serious newspapers that actually showed Xi Jinping, and you could see Trump on one side, and the phrase was, never stop your opponent when he's making a mistake. That's one of them.
Today, I came across a beautiful cartoon in an Italian newspaper. I can't remember which one, but it was fantastic. This isn't about reopening Hormuz, but about locking up Trump. That was pure genius, and it's fantastic. Thank you. Thanks to...
Thanks, mutated. China gives in. Russia is involved. This, thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone. Everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Do something. I also wanted to bring up the Lebanon issue because yes, thanks, everyone. Makes sense. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. They passed a law, and I want to ask you, since you're in the military, if a political law makes sense. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, to all of you. Thank you. I'm talking about the death penalty law that Israel has just brought up, which is quite distressing. And the other thing is, do they really intend to continue the campaign towards Lebanon?
Yes, the campaign. They are continuing. The goal is to occupy a security zone of 10, 20, 30 up to the Litani River, basically. Of course, one might wonder what we do with the UN, which has that zone as its responsibility. But all right, that's a problem that will come up later. The idea is to take a zone, to take a part of Lebanese territory and basically turn it into what it has been for decades. The Golan Heights, which were formerly Syrian but practically Israeli, in order to take parts of the territory of sovereign states, with the argument that this way we guarantee security. If this is the plan, it must be said that Hezbollah is putting up quite a fight. All things considered, it's not like Israel is facing real difficulties as it did in Gaza. And here we return to the point. For many months, Gaza was the training ground for the Israeli Air Force, missiles and drones. But until they sent in the army, meaning soldiers on the ground, they practically solved almost nothing. And the same thing is happening now in Lebanon on a scale enormously larger than in Gaza. And with an opponent, all things considered, quite determined, because I remember that Hezbollah is not a tribe parachuted in from Mars into Lebanon, with nothing to do with that country. It is the armed wing of the Shiite part of the Lebanese population. Those are the Shiite Lebanese who identify with Hezbollah. It's not ISIS, they're not the refugees from Iraq who are in Syria. They are people who, all things considered, are defending their country. So even this, as a willingness to fight, I think should be duly taken into account. Israel is having quite a hard time moving forward in Lebanon with objectives that, if we look at it from the perspective of international law, involve occupying a sovereign country. It shouldn't be acceptable for Putin. It shouldn't be acceptable for Netanyahu either. Usually, it shouldn't be acceptable for anyone. But that's what's happening. Iran, that is southern Lebanon, has turned into the Ukrainian Donbass for Putin. This should also be said to those who are educated. Sorry if I tried your patience.
I observe that Israeli activity in southern Lebanon is déjà vu. It's something they've already done 4 or 5 times, occupying a security zone, and usually it has never served any purpose. I don't see how this time things should be much different. It could have been different if the Israelis had consistently sought an agreement with the Lebanese government, which seemed willing to coordinate with Israel and help eliminate Hezbollah from their side. But it became less and less willing when the Israelis started hitting targets deep inside Beirut. So, frankly, I see both in the Israeli ground operation and in the law you mentioned about the death penalty. Frankly, I see a political move by Netanyahu's government driven by Israeli domestic politics. From what little I know about the political and constitutional situation of the State of Israel, the law on the death penalty has very little chance of passing the scrutiny of the Israeli Supreme Court. It will most likely be rejected as unconstitutional. However, the Netanyahu government will have the opportunity when running in the elections to say, I tried, I wanted to punish the bad guys, but I was prevented from doing so. Moreover, it is not in the interest of the State of Israel to introduce the death penalty, for the simple reason that at that point no one would extradite to Israel anymore, with the risk of seeing people sentenced to death, so it's convenient, contrary to Israeli national interests. And that's also why the Israeli Constitutional Court will almost certainly bury the matter. I see a Netanyahu who is desperately trying to position himself for Israel's next elections.
But, excuse me, Giorgio, isn't it a bit different? Usually they told people to evacuate up to the river line. This time they're saying they want to enter and occupy permanently. It's a bit different, in short, from what they used to do before.
Best wishes. Israel can't afford to give up its connections with the rest of the world. Thank you.
I think that, go ahead, please, come on. I think that many bridges have already been burned. One more or less doesn't make a difference.
That's why I say it's a matter of Israeli domestic politics.
Let me add a few thoughts. 3 weeks ago, the Lebanese government sent a signal, which you referred to earlier, Mirko, saying that we might even recognize the government of Israel. There is a turning point happening in Lebanese society that is a part of the Shiites, as was mentioned. General Capitini, what he said is important. While in Gaza, they are Palestinians who elected them in the elections. The majority of Palestinians in Gaza voted for Hamas. Careful, it's not like Hamas just showed up out of nowhere. The majority of Palestinians in Gaza voted for them, while Hezbollah has nothing to do with the Palestinians. They are Lebanese who take orders from Tehran, and they made a mistake last week. This is acknowledged first of all in Beirut, attacking Israel to avenge the killing of Khamenei in Tehran. It was a strategic mistake by Hezbollah because the Lebanese government was showing signs in some way of wanting to respect the agreements from the past months. When you talk about UNIFIL troops, and there have been about 1,300 Italian soldiers there for 18 years, we must never forget that UNIFIL arrived there 18 years ago. After asking the international community to have Israel withdraw dal sud del Libano, and in exchange it sent thousands of United Nations troops. Somehow to try to limit, if not eliminate, Hezbollah's actions against northern Israel, which never happened. Meaning that for 18 years our soldiers, excellent people and all that, In fact, as the Israelis on the other side of the border have seen, they did not prevent Hezbollah from acting. Now, General Capitini said something interesting, and I agree too. It seems that the Israelis want to maintain a strip of a few kilometers north of Israel in the territory of Lebanon. That is to keep a small buffer zone. While last week there was talk of reaching at least as far as the Litani River, that is, moving up the coast, if you look at how the coast is shaped, about 30 kilometers. This is the problem. Lebanese society, including some of the Shiites, so we have Christians, Shiites, and Sunnis, was ready in some way at a political level to reach a compromise with Israel. The problem is that when the Lebanese government had to trying to remove Hezbollah from southern Lebanon by sending the Lebanese army actually to Beirut, they preferred not to act because the risk was civil war. That is, that the whole country would fall apart again, as unfortunately has happened repeatedly in Lebanon's history. So they basically handed Netanyahu a formidable excuse, because if the Lebanese had cleared southern Lebanon, or at least started to clear southern Lebanon of Hezbollah, the Israelis would have had few excuses to enter, at least on the international level. In reality, since the government in Beirut didn't take action, at that point they handed Netanyahu an excuse and he said, "You're not going in yourselves, even though you'd committed to do it." The international community has been there and hasn't stopped anything for 18 years. I remind you that France and Italy already said in the past weeks that in a few months, the mandate will need to be completely changed. Basically, this operation hasn't really achieved much in 18 years. It has put, as you saw the other day, even our soldiers at risk. This operation definitely has a political purpose. Colonel Stirpe is right in saying that elections will be held in Israel in October, a few weeks before the elections in the United States. The issue of the death penalty from the other day, in Israel it already exists. The death penalty has been used twice. And one of those times was for one of the greatest Nazi criminals, Adolf Eichmann. The issue of the death penalty is entirely internal to the Israeli right wing, to which Netanyahu both wanted and had to make concessions. And I absolutely agree with Colonel Stirpe that the Constitutional Court of the State of Israel will bounce it back to him. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, and in my opinion, even a good part of Israeli society on the right, not all of it, but a good part of the Israeli right, doesn't follow him down this path. The problem is that Netanyahu has been there for about 30 years. He's been there. And Netanyahu is in a situation quite similar to the one Trump and his people face if he loses the elections, in the sense that in Israel, prime ministers go to prison when they steal. When they make big mistakes, they go to prison. For example, I knew Ehud Olmert, who in my opinion was a good prime minister, but he went to prison. In Israel, you go to prison when you steal, even if you are a politician. Netanyahu, his wife and his son, who is in Miami while Israeli soldiers are fighting in Lebanon. The prime minister's son is on the beach in Miami, protected by Israeli guards paid by Netanyahu is in a bad position. He has to try to somehow heal the wound that opened 3 years ago with Gaza. He has always been forgiven even by part of the Israeli right, with voters saying he's the man who guarantees security. So he gets into all sorts of things, deals, messes, he allies with the far right. But this is the problem. Either Netanyahu somehow manages to resolve the issue in southern Lebanon, and even today, I'm not sure he can, or we're back to square one. This thing risks getting tangled up. Let me point out that right now there are 5 Israeli divisions on the front, 5 Israeli divisions. And Israeli society is not able to hold out for long just by physically keeping tens of thousands of men and women, period.
From an aeronautical perspective, they're using a very high percentage. Just a minor point. A question appeared in the chat. It's unverified, but I'm reporting it. It seems that there was a second helicopter, the Black Hawk, that was hit. We'll see if it's true, because as I said, if it's true, the wreckage will surface, they'll show it and things like that. But definitely from the videos I've seen of the activity of the 530 American helicopters, they were shooting at everything. Some with rifles, some with other things, and they were flying very low. They were at great risk. Maybe they risked a lot to get that pilot out. And so sometimes you have to fly 20 or 30 meters above the ground.
Sorry, can I add something to what I think General Capitini said earlier, or maybe Colonel Stirpe, when you were saying the soldiers are deployed on the island? I'll give you my impression after 18 years in Washington. In my opinion, American society doesn't stop just because it loses 500 soldiers. Careful, in my opinion, today's American society, not the one from 20 years ago. If they actually start seeing an American pilot brought in front of Tele-Iran International in a cage, believe me, things get really tough nowadays. Let me point something out. In American society, for at least the past 20 to 25 years, it's been hard to recruit soldiers. When, at the beginning of this conversation, Mirko mentioned the percentage of non-white Christians of Swedish and German origin in the American army, that's really the whole issue. It's an armed force that draws from the poorest, most marginalized part of society. And that's the American we're talking about. It's been at least 20 years since they've taken some hard hits. In Iraq, where mercenaries were already being used, they were called contractors in Washington because we're all politically correct, but they were mercenaries. That is, American society was already having to send highly paid people to Iraq, to Afghanistan. The same nowadays, in my opinion, American society, whether right or left, starting with the MAGA movement. Careful, because it's true that Trump in the polls among his own voters, per l'80-85%, he is still supported by his voters on this war that he calls a special operation. But there is already 10 to 15% who are breaking away. And I'll give you one last point. On the issue of the Middle East, another phenomenon is growing in American society that should also worry Israel. In the American center-right, especially among the younger voters, that is, Trump voters under 35. After all the protests, Gaza, the American universities, and so on, they are no longer in the traditional pro-Israel position. That is, the movement. The American center-right is not only divided on whether or not to fight the wars they had been promised Trump would end, but also on Israel. Obviously, there is also a division within the Democratic Party, but that's been going on for some years now. And now there is also one in a part of the Republican Party. This is for the future. I believe that in Jerusalem, whether it's the right or the left in power, they need to be very careful. Because the moment a part of the electorate breaks away, just imagine if a president like Trump, if he is taking a personal risk, shouldn't he take into account the fact that he's losing support, even regarding what he does or doesn't do towards Israel? This is something I would be very careful about, because there is a change in society.
About the previous news, as you can see, it's an old fake. So, Marco, stop sending me this rubbish.
I told you it wasn't confirmed.
You just had to scroll down, and you already have the comparison with an old video from Syria. Red, damn it, red below. There you go. You wanted to say your piece, so since you joined, say it now, because we won't be here for long. So if you need to vent, do it now.
Now,
The interesting news was that both Haftar and the Ukrainians are, Haftar is buying drones, and there is a contingent of 200 men in Libya that is right on our doorstep. This is the news being reported. You're muted, Oreo. Sorry, always put Oreo in front. Let's always call him Oreo.
But only enemies call him Oreo.
Sorry.
And in the building, I heard that the news got around about the Iranian proposal to the Palestinians. How much truth do you think there is in that?
There are negotiations going on. Everyone is talking to everyone. The petrochemical world is in turmoil, obviously. That is, whatever deal is on the market right now disappears in a few minutes or a few hours, let's say. It's clear that there's a real appetite in this case. Yes. What was it that I wanted to point out to you? The one about Iran is important, about Hormuz's structure, because it could represent a significant shift in the use of currencies. I mean, until recently, everything was always negotiated in dollars. Now the Iranians could require payment in yuan or euros and so on. And even though the volume isn't exceptional, it still has huge importance from the point of view of shifting a reference currency. Until recently, 60% of transactions around the world were in dollars. Another thing was mentioned earlier, maybe it was Paolo who said that the Gulf countries have the money. There are 4 trillion in government bonds and various other investments from the Gulf countries in the US markets. If you look at Mubadala and the various funds, the amount of money invested by the Gulf countries in the United States is overwhelming. Europe has about 18 trillion. The Gulf has about 4, more or less, in government securities, stocks, bonds, and so on. So if the Gulf countries decide to act, they could also act in another way. Do you know that American funds are starting to move and invest in Europe in the emerging ICT market? Because after the French Senate hearing with Microsoft last June, it was like the shot of a starter pistol. Silently, all the CFOs of all the banks and all the government institutions are all moving towards platforms that are entirely European and still need to be built. So OVH Cloud, Mistral AI, and so on. There's a whole stack of applications that, among other things, will be redeveloped, drawing on the experiences of the American market. But there's enormous investment potential, 1.5 trillion just in investments in that sector alone. And the Arabs might decide to finance that part, since it will be a hugely growing market. So Europe has the defense sector, and it has the whole space sector, which is worth several times more than defense and is also connected to defense. So all this really shifts the economic and financial axis, and this situation in the Gulf could be an additional acceleration. That's about all I could add to the scenario.
Maybe it's like what Giorgio Alfaro said. If it's something that lasts a month, you go back to the original system. If it lasts months and months and months, the system adapts, and then the new system becomes the system. And it's not necessarily something you like. I wanted to ask Daniele something. How much do Americans worry about the debt, the costs, the fact that the French withdrew gold from the Fed, the domino effect? How much is the American debt discussed in relation to this mess? Because many countries could also start selling off American government bonds.
Thank you very much.
It's talked about very little in the American media, but if you think back, the US Secretary of Commerce in Davos, when this issue was discussed, did you accept it even before? That is, a colossal part of the American debt is in their hands. To foreign countries that are theoretically considered allies, but that Americans no longer actually consider allies. in a closed-door meeting, he threatened non-American economists behind closed doors. He said, "Don't you dare stop buying our debt." And I remind you that a year ago, less than a year ago, the leader of China, whom Trump will meet in May, told the Americans, "Dear Americans, you are living beyond your means." After that, it's clear that even those who hold American debt, that is us, basically the non-Americans, have no interest in making the system collapse. But, for example, the remarkable rise in gold in recent months is linked to the fact that some of the new investments are no longer going into American debt, but are going into gold or alternative currencies. Ultima cosa. Maybe you've seen it. The plan that increases military spending has been presented from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. With Trump's statement the other night, he said, healthcare expenses, children, you're on your own. Arrangiatevi. It was
Cancelled.
When someone asked him, "Excuse me, but," he said, "let's shift the cost to the individual states. That is, let's move it from the federal government. They'll deal with it, someone else will handle it." Basically shifting the burden onto the poorest part of American society. I'll tell you one last thing. Last summer, if you remember, Trump made a two-pronged move. First, he made a crazy tax cut for the super rich. Second, he said that starting from January 1st, which is now 3 months ago, we're changing the system, the part of public funding that helps pay for the extremely expensive health care of Americans. In other words, we're making the super rich better off and the super poor worse off. So do you understand? When does this mechanism kick in? The problem isn't even just whether foreigners buy American debt or not anymore. The problem is that in May, he wanted to change the Fed to lower interest rates. If you talk about it with Giorgio Alfaras, with some of our very nice and skilled experts, you surely know this. Go check what the interest rates are right now in American banks. That's a whole different story from what he wanted. He had promised to cut the price of gasoline in half. But has anyone noticed that gasoline is almost everywhere above $4 per gallon? In some places, it's getting close to $5. And unfortunately, I'm afraid this situation isn't going to be resolved at all. It's not going to be resolved at all. And to answer a question that one of your followers asked earlier, a very interesting one. Does this change end with the possible end of President Trump's term or not? In my opinion, no. I think the rest of the world is starting to think about a scenario that won't go back to the way it was. Trump's second presidency is not just a temporary interruption in the so-called post-war normalcy my generation knew. Absolutely not. It has become systemic, and for this reason, it opens up new scenarios in the Gulf.
Daniele, what do you think? Japan, relations with Japan. Japan has been cornered by a debt it couldn't keep under control. When Trump started putting pressure with the Liberation Day speech, Japan began to put a lot of its debt and a lot of American debt on the market. How do you see the situation now? People talk about this because Japan and Europe too have their own public debt problems, even if they're much lower. For me, the average European debt is around 80%, but it's being discussed in the United States. It's still a very important trigger.
There's a relationship, in my opinion, that's very ambiguous. On one hand, take Taiwan, for example. The Americans had decided to sell, I think, $10 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan. When Beijing protested to Washington, Washington stopped. At that moment, the new Japanese Prime Minister deployed the missiles. Not far from Taiwan, in the southernmost part of Japan. That made Trump angry too, because then there's this whole thing. In the end, you wonder who's friends with whom. Then there's another thing. By constantly telling the Japanese, like the Germans, we mentioned it earlier, you've lived, you've survived at the expense of American taxpayers. Defense Americans in Washington forget that the Japanese Constitution was forced on them by MacArthur, practically kicking them into it. It basically forbade the Japanese from rebuilding an army. So for 80 years, the Japanese found themselves without a military because the Americans said, you stay put, we'll be there instead. Same thing, even though the situation is very different compared to North Korea and South Korea. Both of them and both countries are considering, for example, nuclear rearmament. In other words, they're starting to realize that with someone like Trump, and maybe not even after him, you can't trust the Americans anymore.
Calm down, calm down.
Just one very quick thing came out.
Director, calm down. Giorgio, I went ahead on your behalf.
Speaking of Japan, it's hardly ever mentioned, but when Trump went on an official visit to Japan, as he got off the plane, he didn't salute the Japanese flag.
No.
And I would like someone to go and watch. There's a video on YouTube, the face of Sani Takaichi when this happened. And I also pair this with
Also with Pearl Harbor, when he said Pearl Harbor.
Whereas Takaichi, who went to Washington, and the Pearl Harbor speech, Takaichi was a fan of Trump. I doubt she still is. And if we add to this the whole show about Ben Salman, who now should kiss my ass. I think there are many world leaders who have drawn their own conclusions. I'll give the floor to Paolo for the final round of conclusions.
But surely what we're experiencing, no one ever realizes the times they're living in. This is a constant in history. Roman citizens didn't realize that in a short time the Roman Empire would come to an end. In 1915 in Vienna, perhaps no one suspected that the Habsburg Empire would come to an end. Would end within 2 or 3 years and so on.
Quindi magari possiamo...
To imagine that the American empire, or whatever you want to call American dominance in the world, is entering a phase of profound change. Americans haven't realized it, but they unconsciously show it by selecting a certain type of leadership. Can you imagine what chance someone like Trump would have had competing against Roosevelt, for example, something like that? Each community instead produces politicians who reflect how it feels at that moment, and that's what we're seeing now. It's an America that, as Daniele rightly said, is extremely confused internally and extremely defensive. It's not out of the question that in the future there could be a division within the United States, a civil war. Again, why do I say that? When you make coexistence with your fellow citizens impossible, and when the territorial size of the country allows you not to feel much kinship with someone who lives 3 time zones away from you, it's not out of the question. And this is the first phase, the second phase. It's well known that in history there are no voids. So if this kind of dominance fades, it will be replaced by someone else. And if we really have to weigh it up, I regret the fact that I'm living in a time when I'm witnessing the decline of this American century. Because what will come after will be, for our grandchildren or even great-grandchildren, definitely very different.
Molto più chiuso e brutto di...
Ours has been like this all these years, but that's how history goes. They took ideas, they didn't do things, they did things, as Giorgio rightly said, without They started hitting the rest of the world without considering that the world is a sack. So it can take it all, but everyone gets tired. The United States for 60 or 70 years have been able to calibrate their power. Power enough to make you imagine it without having to show it. Now they've started showing their strength at the very moment when they're at their weakest. It's not a great choice. Let's see how it ends. In my opinion, it won't end very well, but not tomorrow. There will be a period of many, many years in which we'll still find ourselves talking about these things in different parts of the world. Of course, today China comes out of this strengthened. Why? The United States, which can't manage to impose any kind of strategy on a small power like Iran compared to China, is quite reassuring for Beijing if that's how you handle Iran. Just imagine when you come to butt heads with us, how will you end up?
That is, the Russians on one side, the Americans on the other, are the
two oldest cultures. They're Western cultures. Even the Russians are a Western culture in a certain way. On the other hand, there's another aspect of Western culture, which is the American one. And these two forms of the West, in reality, are mistaking things that are not Western for things that are. India, China, and other parts of the world, on the other hand, are beginning to have a clear vision. It's not certain that it's secure or that it will stay that way in the future, but there is a clear vision of what they want to achieve. We Westerners from the East, let's include the Russians, and from the West, let's include the Americans. We're going through a period where we don't understand a thing. Well, anyway, we'll see.
It's been 2 hours, almost 20 minutes, so I want to thank everyone who followed us. Then Marco will do a special live just for you next week. I'll also be back with updates on Ukraine because things there are still moving slowly, even slower than usual, but they're still moving. By the way, there was a Ukrainian mechanized attack that tried to replicate exactly what the Russians often do. Pokrovsk ended in a disaster, exactly like the Russians, so no one is succeeding on that scale. I don't know why. I don't think retaking a district of Pokrovsk is a strategic or fundamental issue after they advanced on Kresin. But in this war, everyone launches these little attacks and they end very badly for the vehicles. I think this is the biggest event that has happened in the past week. So I want to thank General Capitini, Colonel Stirpe Marco, and also Daniele Moro for joining in earlier. Thank you to everyone who has followed us for these 2 hours and almost 20 minutes. It's almost 11:30. Good night to all of you.